So we're finally starting to see how huge the screw-ups were around the handling of COVID-19 beginning in March of 2020. And what's clear is that all of the pillars on which the response was based are crumbling in the face of scrutiny to smoke and ash. The latest horror came in a piece in the Daily Mail, which is one of the papers that pushed the fear and did some of the absolute worst reporting on COVID of anybody, but they've turned a corner. And they have an investigative group there who are now going back and looking at all the myriad mistakes that were made around COVID policy. The piece they published this week has the headline of, "Did flawed tests convince us COVID was worse than it really was?" I mean, remember those big flashing numbers on your TV screen, or the ones, kind of below the fold in your newspaper every day, day after day, scaring the living shit out of everybody for a very long time, traumatizing the population? Those were PCR tests. Those of us who were looking carefully at the science behind the test knew that they were running these tests at a cycle threshold way too high that was cranking out a whole bunch of false positive results. We knew it. We said it. People were deplatformed for saying it. They were called conspiracy theorists for saying it. And yet, like everything else that was criticized by sane people doing the actual journalism over the last 2 years, that was a criticism of policy, they didn't listen, and we were criticized for it. Now, la-di-da, Daily Mail, based on a study, are suggesting exactly what we were saying all along. And that is that the PCR tests were garbage at doing a very, very granular look at who was positive and who wasn't. Most places were running the so-called cycle thresholds too high, including where I am. Some of them were running it at 40, when 30 is about right. And even so, these are not tests that are super accurate, and they skew to false positives. So this is pillar number one, was this mass crazy testing. The other pillar that's fallen, again, there was an article about it because there were hearings in the UK about the modeling. The people doing this extreme modeling, like Neil Ferguson and other people who were reporting to Sage, there was a bunch of people out in Washington State as well who were doing it, and here where I am in Ontario, Canada, the numbers were wildly off the mark over and over and over again, and yet governments continued to use these modelers as a way to direct their response vis-a-vis lockdown, school closures, et cetera, to COVID-19. The numbers were wrong, and they were never wrong on the low side. They were always wrong on the high side. So again, there's now good reporting suggesting the modeling was wrong. And there is some talk now, some of the people going under oath in the UK about this at this hearing said, well, we didn't mean them to take us all that seriously. We were just guessing, but everybody did take them seriously. And those high numbers, again, scared everybody and caused the governments to do extreme things in response to them because they were afraid of those numbers from a not maybe a public health perspective also, but also from a publicity point of view. Nobody can ignore those numbers once they're out there. It's a height of irresponsibility to put those modeling numbers out the way they were and to take them seriously at all. So the PCR tests were wrong. The modeling was wildly off the mark. We know that the lockdowns, according to a Johns Hopkins study that came out a few weeks ago and caused quite a stir, said that actually the lockdowns did more harm than good. They didn't protect people. They didn't save any lives. So that failed as well. And the vaccines now, if you look at what's happening in Israel and the UK too, I believe, they're not preventing transmission. They just don't do that anymore. So the safe and effective mantra around vaccines also failed. Everything they've done has failed. Putting the COVID recovery on vaccines was also a failing policy. So I just want to say this to be clear. We now have solid information that virtually everything they did in response to COVID-19 either did nothing or made it worse. Think about that. This is, without a doubt, the biggest public policy screw up in modern times, maybe ever. You know, bigger than the Vietnam War, right? I mean, I think 59,000 American soldiers died in the Vietnam War. I don't know how many Vietnamese, but many, many, many. But even still, that is eclipsed by the number of people harmed by lockdowns, harmed by vaccines. And a traumatized Western world that believed in the fake numbers that were suggesting that we were all going to get it, we were all going to die. So this is something that we really need to absorb. I know that Ukraine is kind of hogging the stage right now, and you know, the Ukraine's important for absolutely for sure, especially because there's a nuclear component to this, and we need to think seriously about that, actually an existential threat. But we cannot let this go. We mustn't let it go. We must never forget what these people did, and we must never forget how the people who were calling them on it for 2 years. I started my podcast in April of 2020. I called out the folly of the way the COVID response was proceeding in March of 2020 in a letter I sent to journalists. I started the podcast in April of 2020 and have called out all of these things all along, like for a year and a half. And there were experts out there willing to come on and talk about every single one of these issues, lockdowns, PCR tests. We had Kevin McCarran on, he's brilliant, knows more about it than anybody. We had all these people on saying what people are only officially looking at now. I don't know why. Is it because of Ukraine? Is it because Ukraine has turned the attention away from what happened with COVID-19? Are people moving on? And so now reporters can try to sneak these stories in as if they weren't complicit. I mean, the Daily Mail used the word conspiracy theory about a lot of wonderful people who called this stuff out early. So we must never forget. We must find a way to call these people out, to understand how this happened, how groupthink and mass hysteria infected our expert class, who were the worst of anybody in believing the nonsense. I mean, Neil Ferguson's numbers were insanely high and never panned out. And yes, he kept advising the Sage body in the UK. None of it makes any sense. None of it. And we must never, ever let this happen again. Please understand the way I started this midweek meltdown today by saying every single pillar of the COVID response is now crumbling. It's turning to ashes and dust. There's nothing left of it. None of it's defensible. And it's going to be very interesting to see if there's another COVID wave coming. There may well be. There's likely something going on in China right now, and maybe starting up in the UK. Unclear about that, because obviously if it's based on test results, we can't really trust them if they're using PCR. And they've lied about so much to us, constantly lied, constantly deplatformed the truth tellers, punished the truth tellers, fired the truth tellers, right? That when something, it's like the boy who cried wolf, if there is another big outbreak coming, people are going to be skeptical about it. But also, then what is the public health response? It can't be lockdowns and school closures again, right? It can't be that. We can't be testing people with PCR because we know it doesn't work. So if there's a new phase coming down the pike at us, now that we know that everything they did failed, we've got to be rethinking that too. What do we do? I suspect, as you know, we should be doing what the great Barrington Doc said, which is focus protection, protect the vulnerable, and let everybody else go on about their business with certain common sense public health measures in place, not lockdowns, not school closures, by the way. So we really have to look now at where we go for here, given that public health and our leaders have totally trashed their own credibility. They don't have any anymore. They owe us an apology. And, obviously we're never, ever going to get one. But as the media kind of pushes these little bits of undeniable information out here and here and here, never a headline, but here and here and here, we're starting to get a full picture of what perfectly competent people have been saying all along. I used to say it when the big tech folks deplatform people like Martin Kulldorff. I said, when they do that, when they cut off actual scientific debate, they're going to be causing deaths. And that when the day comes when we can say that these people were right, that big tech and legacy media are going to have to take responsibility for what they've done here. Forget the leaders, they're just out to lunch. We don't trust them at all anymore to do anything. And big tech now, they're completely not credible as honest brokers, just absolutely not honest brokers. And legacy media, they really need to sort themselves out, because they helped create, instead of reporting on it, they helped create this huge public health problem. So the next few weeks should be interesting. See ya.